We'll now proceed to our morning session on Global Biodiversity, the 2030 Agenda. Please welcome on stage the moderator of this session from the University of Lisbon, Cristina Mágoas.
Good morning to everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the first session of the Green Week opening conference here in Lisbon on Global Biodiversity, the 2030 Agenda. And nothing better than to start with Miguel Araújo from Museu Nacional de Ciências Naturais and the Universidade de Évora, with the title Biodiversity Adaptation and the Climate Change.
Distinguished authorities, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, here and there. Talking about biodiversity is talking about nature. And these days, talking about nature is talking about diminishing numbers. Something extraordinary happened 50 years ago. We start adding 1 billion people to the planet every 10 years. To really grasp how important that is, just think that 200 years ago, we were 1 billion people. And that was the record high in the history of humankind. Now that's exactly that number we are adding every 10 years. Of course, that has a huge impact on how we use the planet. There's a number of factors, driving forces of those changes, which are listed in this slide. And if you can see the pies, you can see what's the proportional impact of each of these driving forces to changes in biodiversity. Africa, for example, has lost about 65% of its biodiversity in these 50 years. And one of the most important, the most important, has been land transformation, land and sea transformation, mainly for production of fiber and agriculture. And then there's overexploitation of species. But those two categories really are about eating. We are eating our planet and our biodiversity. And then there's invasive species and disease, and that has to do with globalization. We are moving around more than ever. We started globalization 500 years ago, but it has increased enormously in the recent years. And then we have pollution, we all know about it, and climate change. Climate change is the small section of this pie, because we're talking about the past 50 years. What I'm going to show today is that I believe climate change will jump in terms of the impact in the next 50 years enormously, unless we take action. But let's look at the patterns, because this is not just words. And the map that you're seeing is the map of agriculture intensification, agriculture transformation around the world. Where you see red is that there's basically enormous transformation of the land to open space for new agricultural areas. And you see the red basically covering most of the tropical belt. More recently, this is between 1998 and 2001, but more recently there has been an increment of that pattern. We know about Southeast Asia in particular because we've all seen David Attenborough's images of orangutans losing their homes. So that's for palm oil plantations, plantations to produce palm oil that we eat every day in the breakfast with our cereals. Then we have the Congo Basin in Africa that is also being deforested to fiber and food at enormous speed. And of course the Amazon rainforest that we all know about it. But not just the so-called rainforest is being burned out and cut down, also the surrounding areas of seasonal tropical climate yielding the savannas in Africa, for example, in Eastern Africa, but also in Brazil, the Cerrado type system, which is a savanna, is a South American savanna. They're also being cut down and burned at a very high speed to produce agriculture, to produce food. there's another parallel trend which is about converting wetlands into farmland. And I've pointed that area there, which is in fact the gray area with no data in this map. And that's the south of Sudan. South of Sudan has a huge wetland in the Nile, and that was the last frontier in the Roman Empire. They couldn't cross it because it was so wild. And even today is one of the most remote and inaccessible areas of the planet, except that there are billions of dollars that are being flooded into that region to convert it into huge agricultural farm. So that's what's happening at the moment. And of course, we already had that kind of transformation in Europe and in North America, so why would they not have the same right to do the same thing that we've done in the past, right? That's an ethical question, a very difficult question that we all have to address, and it has been addressed, of course. But there's something different now, is that all of these transformations are happening in the biodiversity hotspots of the world. These areas in red are the areas with lots of biodiversity. In that particular case, I'm showing birds, but it doesn't really change for other organisms. So all of this transformation of the land that I've just shown you is happening in areas of huge biodiversity. And just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the differences, if just for the Amazon rainforest, there's an estimated 16,000 species. In 1 hectare of forest in the Amazon, we may have as many species or even more than the whole of the Iberian Peninsula. And because of something we know in biogeography, it's called Rapoport rule, there's a tendency for rarity to increase as we go closer to the tropics. There's many more rare species in the tropics than there are in higher latitudes. This means that for every hectare that we lose, we may be losing species because there are lots of rare species that occur there. So that is really is a catastrophe of global proportions that is happening under our nose as we speak. There's another element. When I talk biodiversity now, I was talking about the composition, the species. But biodiversity is also function. And one of the functions it has is to cycle carbon. And is what was already mentioned. Nature has the role of cycling the carbon, fixing carbon, and transforming some areas into carbon sinks. And if you look at the blue areas here, are the areas of greater primary production of the ecosystems. That's where more carbon is fixated through the photosynthesis. It's not the most efficient. There are other areas of the planet with less carbon that absorb more carbon per unit time and per unit area, because there's lots of respiration as well in tropical areas. But in fact, that's the greatest reservoirs of living carbon. So as they are being burned and if they are being destroyed, we are basically transferring all of this carbon to the atmosphere and further increasing climate change. So climate change, when we talk about climate change, we have to realize that as there are multiple threats to biodiversity that I just mentioned, the big five, there's also multiple dimensions to climate change. Climate change is not just a word. It encapsulated different patterns and different processes. So one of the most important is the loss of habitat, loss of area. And who doesn't know the figure of the polar bear hanging on a piece of ice in the sea as an icon of that image? But really, the ice, the polar region, especially in the northern hemisphere, is losing ice at an unprecedented rate, and we are heading towards ice-free summer area in the Arctic. And the polar bears, of course, they will lose their habitat. They've evolved to live in that area. And if they have to move, of course, they can move away south, and they will encounter forest, and they will encounter brown bears. And there's already cases of hybridization of brown bears and polar bears, which means that if that happens in big numbers, in the end, the polar bears will disappear, as the Neanderthals did when they started to cross with Homo sapiens. So one way to get extinct is to cross with the dominant species, not just to die. And then there's also sea level rise, and this is the Bramble Cay Melomis is perhaps the first element that was reportedly extinct due to climate change in a tiny island of Papua New Guinea because of sea level rise. 97% of the habitat of the island, of the small island, was flooded, and they basically lost their area of living. So loss of area. A second type of climate change is the emergence of novel climates. or non-analog climates. What does it mean? It means that there are new climates coming up in our times. Of course, they might have occurred in the past. We had many different climates in the past, but we actually changing the climate and creating new areas, areas with new different types of climate. And there's these two graphs. One is that I produced for Europe, where we see towards the end of the century, those areas with colors are areas that are projected to have climates that today do not exist in Europe. And the lower graph shows, in areas in red, those areas of the planet that are projected to also have completely different climates as they are today. Monsoon, seasonal, tropical climates, for example, that occurred in the past. So that, of course, that brings impacts, that brings especially uncertainty, because we don't really know exactly what these climates are, and now biodiversity is going to react to it. Of course, it will need to adapt, which is what we're talking today here. Finally, there's another regional type of impact, which is fragmentation. Climate change, as it reshuffles the distributions of habitats, reshuffles the distributions of climates, will force species to move. But there's a fragmentation of those habitats, not just caused by climate change, but also due to human impacts. For example, the penguins, you all also know about the penguins, these penguins that the males keep the eggs while the female goes and finds food. One feature of those species is that the foraging territory and the breeding territory are separated. And that separation is already increasing, which means that at some point it might be too far away to keep those populations viable. So that's an example of fragmentation. We have one closer to home, which is the Iberian lynx. It has been studied by people in my group and with colleagues, where we've shown that the areas that are suitable for Iberian lynx, especially also for the rabbits, they will gradually move north in the Iberian Peninsula as the time goes by, also forcing the Iberian lynx to have to move, or we having to move them if we want them to survive in a changing climate. So this poses a number of questions in terms of land management, which I'll just touch upon next. So there's another type of impact. So these three types of impacts are what I call regional impacts, because they occur at large scales, and they only make sense when you compare areas with another ones. But there's what happens locally as well, the anomaly, how much change is going to happen in a given area. And we usually talk about anomalies as mean anomalies, how gradually the climate is going to change. And of course, that has strong impacts, but they can be gradual. So as, for example, as the temperature increases and the rainfall decreases in some parts, for example, of South Portugal, there's going to be less recruitment of trees, of young trees. So the old ones will stand for many years without new young trees resprouting, because the climate is changing and becoming less suitable for that sort of thing. But there's also an increase in extreme events like heat waves. And heat waves have a distinctive mark because they also affect adults. They also affect established biodiversity by killing them in big numbers. So that can create a state shift, a tipping point that switches a landscape into another one in a matter of just a few years. That's with heat waves, but there's other types of climate extremes like hurricanes that were already mentioned, and floods. Hurricanes in particular, they completely destroy mangroves and also coral reefs, and the increase in the magnitude and the frequency is already having a huge effect in some parts of the world. So if we put all of these together, we get this nice spider diagram. I'm sure you love my spider diagram. But so in the bottom there's a map, and the colors of the map, they characterize different climates. So you've got dark blue is polar climate, and for example red is tropical areas. And what we see is the spider diagram. This shows for each one of these types of dimensions of climate change, how they are bound to change in every one of these climate regions. And for example, the dark blue, you can see this huge spike, which is by basically 100% loss of area, of polar area, by the end of the century. So there won't be any polar area by the end of the century if we continue with climate change as is. But then you can see the red one. The red one, there's basically an increment of extreme events and anomalies and emergence of novel climates in tropical areas. So that's a different type of impact, which will have different consequences for biodiversity, but they will be large, and that are the regions with greatest biodiversity in the world. So when we actually combine all of these things and generate models of impact, we can assess what's likely to be happening to biodiversity, and in this particular case, biodiversity in protected areas across Europe. And we can think of, like in any crisis, of the winners and the losers. Not everyone is going to lose, but the ratio of winners and losers is clearly towards more species losing than more species winning. And that's what you see with a map colored with blue. Every dot in this map is a protected area. And when it's shown as blue, it means that there's more species losing climate space than gaining climate space. Portugal is actually, with the arrow over there, is one of the countries where this ratio is less positive. We are amongst the biggest losers in terms of biodiversity. So this begs the question of how can we address? And technically, there's a number of things we can do. One of them is to increment the ability of species to move around the ecosystem, because mobility is a great asset for adaptation. And we can build infrastructure like the one on the left, or we can adjust land planning like the one on the right by incorporating, by leaving nature inside heavily managed land. And there's a number of techniques which I'm not going to detail to do that. So that is possible to do scientifically. And that's one example of a draft possible set of corridors, networks, linking protected areas across the Iberian Peninsula to enable this tracking of climate change. Coming back to the beginning of this talk, climate change is one driving force. I predict it to become very important in the next 50 years. But it interacts with other threats. And in this particular case, for example, on the left, we're looking at the interaction between a disease affecting amphibians in the world, and amphibians are the most threatened group of vertebrates in the world, with more than 30% of species facing extinction. And that is showing where the threats are going to be due to climate change, where the threats are going to be to the chytridiomycosis, a disease affecting them, a fungus, and in yellow, where there's interactions between climate change and the disease. And in the second map, we can see the same sort of things with land use change and climate change, and finally land use change and disease. So these things interact sometimes additively, sometimes multiplicatively, and it begs the question of how can we address it. And I would say that there's two lines of action that we have to take. One of them is to shield nature from development, from bad development, and restore it. If you ever wondered what's the meaning of that English sentence, you can't have the cake and eat it too, that's a good representation. You can't have nature in protected areas and eat it too at the same time. So if you want to have nature in protected areas, you have to protect it as a sanctuary. You have to keep it. You have to nourish. You have to restore it. So that's one priority, and there's many things we can do. We have to invest. We have to do better science, better applied science, but we also have to increase the level of priority of biodiversity in the political agenda, which is very happily happening at a European level at the moment, very positive. But that's something, it's not about them, the politicians, and us, the citizens, it's about everyone, because politics sometimes follows the crowd and sometimes leads the crowd. That has always been like that. So the crowd plays a very important role. Then finally, there's regulations. The regulations have to be adapted to the goals and have to be adapted to the reality of the country, of every country. It's not the same as managing a protected area where it's owned by the government or it's owned by just one private owner, or a protected area owned by thousands of owners. So it's different. So it has to be adjusted, but it has to be adjusted with efficiency and effectiveness. And then, finally, there's the second area. The second area of work is that once we've ensured that we can shield and we can protect and we can restore the nature that is already there, we have to increase it. And E.O. Wilson is a 91-years-old biologist, probably the most important biologist alive, and he wrote his book, Half Earth, where he argues, he defends the idea that we should protect half the Earth from development, just leave it for nature, and then do our own business in the rest of the planet. And that, of course, is being seen as too visionary. But I mean, I remember when I was an undergraduate student and then a master's student, and we were still striving to get to the target of 10% of the planet protected. I went in 2003 to the World Parks Congress in Durban in South Africa, and where it was announced that finally we had 10% of the land protected, and the new target was to achieve that for the oceans. Now we have about 16 to 17% of the land protected, and the European Union just set a target of protecting 30% of the land across Europe, sea and land, a target that is likely to be discussed at the United Nations conference in China during next year. So what is a visionary statement from an old man today might become truth, perhaps not for my generation, but for Greta Thunberg's generation. What we now have to do is to focus on these 30% for 2030. After that, others will come, other players will come, other generations will come, and they will take their responsibilities, and they probably will be more ambitious than we are. That's everything I want to say. Thank you very much.
Well, now we are going to listen to Ruben Heleno from Universidade de Coimbra on protecting the web of life, the value of pollinating services. And I'd just like to hold all your questions, because we are going to have a round table where then you can tweet all your questions. Thank you.
Distinguished authorities, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. The reason why I'm here is to tell you why our quality of life and our life depends on the work of little fluffy things like this and the work they're doing outside just now. But before I got there, I want to tell you a real story of something that happened when I was preparing this talk, which is my wife got home with this thing, this screw, that she found inside her car. And she doesn't know where it comes from, and I have no idea where it comes from, but it seems something big. The car is working fine, we cannot see where it's coming, so we assume that it's probably not very important. But this got me thinking on another big machine that also is formed by many million parts, in this case approximately 9 million parts, which is our planet, okay? So then I went to Wikipedia trying to imagine what other machines have approximately this number of parts, and very luckily, the biggest planes we ever built have approximately 7 million parts as well. So that works for the analogy I want to make today, which is very fortunate because our planet, like a plane, works because all these small parts are doing something, and the whole system, the whole machine, it's pretty much isolated from the rest when it turns to continue its doing its function, okay? So that's very important to start with this big picture. And I want to start looking at the world. This is how we think it is as ecologists. And this is how the world actually is. Okay, so in here, green, it's not forests, not sure you can see, but it's global roads. So actually, one species out of this 9 million, we got everywhere, and we absolutely changed the planet, okay? We already know this. Not only we transformed it, but we connect systems that have never been connected before, and this has a huge impact. So at a small scale, we are in a conflict with biodiversity. This is not a conflict of interests in bigger scales, but on a smaller scale, it's true. So when we expand our activities, of course, we repel biodiversity, and this made us reach to this point where up to 1 million species are now estimated to be threatened with extinction. I say estimated, well, this is a big number again. It's 1 out of every 9 species it's threatened. What's funny, well, it's not really funny, but only 30,000 species, which is an infamous part of this, have already been named. We know their names, what they are, what they do. The vast majority, we have no idea well, we know where they are, but we have not even give them a name. And the reason why we know they are threatened is because entire habitats are threatened, and they're taking all the species in there before we even get to know them and what they do. So a big part of my job as ecologist and the job of many ecologists is to try to imagine what happens or what is happening when we're losing parts, like this one. Okay, so you might know the dodo. How bad is it when we lose a dodo, a mosquito, a snake, whatever? How bad is it? And to look first at our planet again. So this is what we know. This is the biodiversity of our planet. Most of it is made of plants because they harvest the energy of the sun. Then we have a lot of bacteria, fungi, and all the animals are there in that small square. And if we zoom up on animals, we'll see that most of it are arthropods. That most of the arthropods are insects. We can use mostly arthropods and insects as an analogy today. Then there's a lot of fish, and humans and livestock, together we made up approximately 7% of the biomass. So you might think that it's not too much, but it's only 10 or 20 species that make all of this biomass. So we're very important into how this machine, how the plane is actually working, because this was not used to do, it used not to be like this. And maybe you can't see, but all the wild animals, all the buffaloes, the giraffes, the zebras, the rhinos, the pandas, the polar bears, all of that together is less than 1% of the animal biomass, okay? So what we did is we totally shaped the living part of the planet to the purposes that suit us better. But the story I'm going to focus today is on actually the love story between these two very important players, plants and insects. And the reason why this is so important is because plants, they have a relatively good life, but they have a big problem, which is they can't move. And if you can't move, that affects a lot of parts of your life, and particularly reproduction. So in order to reproduce sexually, plants found this system through evolution that they put the DNA into pollen, exactly like the same as it's a good analogy to human sperm. And then this pollen has to find a female part of another flower if they want to reproduce sexually. So one option is to throw millions of pollen grains into the air. That might work, but that's very inefficient because most pollen will just get to the ground, and it's very unlikely that we'll find a female flower organ, okay? I don't need to tell you what's the equivalent organ in humans for you to know that this is pretty big business, okay? And through the natural history, a much better system evolved, which was if plants offer insects a meal, insects can move very easily, so the insects come from the meal and they take the pollen and they don't go just randomly anywhere. They go specifically to another flower. So that's a very, very efficient mechanism to take pollen, to take sperm to another flower. And this works very well, and this is very, very important for the continuation of all plants on our planet, okay? So if we look at Europe, we now estimate that approximately 80% of the plants in Europe use this system. And this is how a strawberry, for example, after a flower we have a strawberry, in the case of a strawberry plant. This is how a strawberry looks like if the system is working fine, if the plant has the pollinators it needs. And this is how a strawberry looks like without pollinators. So obviously, if you're thinking about eating a strawberry or about selling a strawberry, this is a very big difference. So I'm going to show you now this one example of how this thing works in one place. I'm going to pick the Botanical Garden of Coimbra because it's the data I have to show you, but this could be anywhere in Europe or anywhere in the world. It would be always the same. So here we have, each box is one species of plant. Okay, so we have many plants in the Botanical Garden. And now I'm going to, for one spring, we've been looking and identifying absolutely every insect that visited these plants, okay? And this is what we found out. More than 300 insects visiting these plants and helping them to reproduce. This is nothing especially about this botanical garden. If we look in Europe, we have already identified more than 2,000 of bees doing this job for plants as pollinators, 1,000 of hoverflies, 8,000 species of moths, 500 species of butterflies, flies, wasps, beetles, other insects and birds. And all of these insects, well, all of these animals, they have different preferences. So you will see, for example, that the honeybee, that it's there, the bigger box in the middle, it likes many plants. It's not really fussy. It goes to many flowers, and it does the job relatively okay for many flowers. While other insects, like the one in the corner there, it's very specialized. It only likes some flowers, and some flowers rely on the service of only that bee, okay? And maybe the most at the extreme of this example, it's this moth in Madagascar and this orchid that for 7.4 million years, they have only been visiting each other. Okay, so this orchid only accepts this moth, and this moth only visits this orchid for 7.5 million years. This is quite amazing, and we can imagine that it's not something irrelevant to lose one of them to the other, okay? So now we move to a different setting, but exactly the same thing. This is a farm. It's a network made by colleagues where we have the dots in the middle are the plants, and then we have all the insect pollinators pollinating these plants, but we have also all the animals and the mites and the birds and the rodents. Being a farm, there's only something very important missing here. Probably you're already thinking of it, which is the farmer, right? So we try to think of natural systems as something that is separate from us. But the farmer also feeds on whatever is on that farm. So we're one node inside this big network. And no matter how much technology we have, we're still one node that eats other nodes. That's our biology, and that's not going to change. So we need to consider how, when we change all that web that supports life, how that affects our node, because we're naturally interested on it. On our survival. So if we look at Europe, it's been estimated that 84% of the crops depend or benefit from this pollination system. So this is something that really affects our node. It doesn't mean that, especially in rich countries like ours, we can probably find other things to eat. It doesn't mean that we will run out of food, but it means definitely that we'll have less diversity, less quality, and higher prices on our food. But even more important than that is that globally, more than 1/3 of the global crop production is dependent on the services of pollinators. And this is very important, particularly for developing countries which don't have so much facility to get other types of food. So it's just illogical we cannot aim to target to finish hunger if we lose 1/3 of the food in the world. It's an impossible solution. So we have to solve this issue. But it's not only food. We depend on a lot more things on pollinators. And actually, just protecting pollinators, we target at least 6 sustainable development goals, because they are also very important to keep healthy life on land, to keep circular economy, to fight climate change, and to help us to reach more sustainable societies. Unfortunately, this is the pattern. So there's many good science showing us that insects have been declining since the 70s. This is the result of a large project by the International Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And they identified the main causes that are driving this decline on pollinators. Many of them have already been talked here today. What I want you to think when we're seeing this line going down, we might be tricked to think that works more or less like the stock market, that some weeks are down, then goes up, then goes down, like it goes up again, like oil prices, but it's not. This is a line that can only go down. So it either goes down or is stable, because we cannot produce pollinators or in factories. It takes millions of years to produce pollinators. So our best thing we can hope for is to stabilize this, but we can never go up. So this is something really important that we need to consider, okay? Finally, all of these drivers that are here affecting pollinators have been shown to affect pollinators and thus our ability to get food, affect other wildlife. So for example, another problem for plants that they are stuck in the same place for all their lives is that they also need assistance from animals to take their seeds. So if there's a very big fire, the only way that some plants can go back to that place is if a mammal or a big bird takes that seed and takes it back to that forest. And outside of, in the real world, animals are doing exactly that for us, for free. So if we look at other types of ecosystem services that also depend on biodiversity, this is a relatively recent study which shows that the red line is how much we need that ecosystem service today to keep our life going. And the white circle represents how much we are getting it from nature. So you can see that pollination, so we're getting already less pollination than we need. We need more pollinators than we have now. But if we look at the estimate of how much will we get from these services in 2050, this is the estimate. So all of them will be provided by nature in less supply that we need. We need a lot more of these services. So if you're thinking that this is catastrophic, you thought right, it's really catastrophic. There's only one good thing, is that the solution to tackle all of these services is the same. The solution and it's simple. It's biodiversity. The way to build resilience, to be ready for change, is to build up biodiversity. This is the same thing, the same solution will improve all of those ecosystem services. Okay? So the main message, we already know that we are dependent on life and on plants and animals, not only to eat, but on all the other services that we get from them. Now, what I also want you to think today is that all of these animals, they are also dependent on other animals or on the plants that they also feed. And as we've just seen, the plants also depend on the diversity of animals. And we could go on and try to make this web more complicated. But the message is always the same, is that we are one node in one network, and we need the healthy of the entire system for our own good, to keep us going. So if we think about this plane again, you can try to imagine that you're sitting on a seat, but not here on the auditorium, but on a plane, and that the captain is telling us that, well, we lost a screw. But don't worry, because this plane has 7 million screws, so we're probably fine. It's probably not going to make any difference. Right? So this doesn't seem very, very clever. And the more conservative estimates are telling us that the minimum estimate, we lose 1 species per day. So we lost 1 species yesterday, we will lose 1 species today, we'll lose 1 species tomorrow, and if you think about this in 1 week, we will have lost 7 species, okay? So the higher estimate goes to hundreds, but the minimum is at least 1 species per day. So I'd like to finish with the words of Leopold, a very important naturalist in North America, where just to say that the minimum thing we could say is that this is not intelligent. Okay. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to everyone, to the two speakers. So in order to recover some time, I'd like to invite you to do a break just for 10 minutes, and we'll be back and we will restart at 10:20. Thank you very much.
Ah, tá aqui.
Então, muito boa tarde. Welcome back. And so we are going to continue our session on biodiversity, global biodiversity, the 2030 agenda. Now we are going to welcome and to present Paulo Farinha Marques from the Botanical Garden of Porto with the title Bringing Biodiversity Back into Cities.
Good morning, hello, I'd like to thank the Deputy Mayor, José Sá Fernandes, for this marvelous organization, and he's been totally involved in trying to fight the virus with this energy, which is really important. And I'm also very happy to be here, and I'd like to thank Miguel Araújo, which brilliantly set up this conference and keep us in contact with all this issue of biodiversity. I'm a landscape architect and I design landscapes which have biodiversity in mind. And I think it's very important to bring this biodiversity in contact to people and bring this biodiversity in contact to places where we live. It's not easy, it's a challenge, and basically because we need to experience and exercise this contact that we have been doing for thousands and thousands of years, but recently we have been living apart more and more. We are even more engaged with screens and networks of invisibility than the tangible life we live today with living things. So what I do, I try to organize space, to plan, design and manage and developed as much as possible to exalt nature, because it's not negotiable. So the idea to do that is to plan and, in our cities, to create a network, just like any issue that has been addressed here already, to plan a network of living things that can get together and communicate and reproduce, have shelter, and also give us all we need from nature, basically because we cannot live without nature. So the first step, and this is the case of Porto I'm presenting to you, which is an exercise we've been doing for 10 years already, we have to sense the natural places of the city, the places that still are the main metabolism of the city, which we have been covering with construction and with trying to disguise this as much as possible. But sooner or later, one road will collapse, sooner or later, one flood will come up, sooner or later, one tree will fall over your car. And you have to do with that and deal with that and plan with that. So Porto has been identified with its natural systems and also the systems we are constructing and cultivating. So my job is very much concentrating with the idea of cultivated biodiversity. I do cultivate biodiversity. I try to promote it. That's what we've also been doing for ages, more or less since we became farmers and later as gardeners. So we have to do that, see where are the places we garden, we keep our plants and animals nearby to our home. Combining these places in a network of systems, the natural ones and the man-made ones, or the human-made ones, we can come up with, let's say, a network of green spaces, and this network connected and push deputies and all the decision makers to connect them. We may have a better future in our sites, in our societies, in our cities. But of course, this is not enough. Alongside with planning, we have also to design. We have also to organize in a fine way, in a very tuned way with the resources, with the materials, and with the people who live there, the space, so we can optimize the relationship between the living beings in these places. And this is a fine-tune. So we select these two places in Porto where we are trying to establish the connections that are missing or they are not being very well developed. One of them is Asprella in the north side, is in a university campus, and in the south side we have the Botanical Garden. all these places are very important link points, although one is new and the other one is old. Esprella has been turned from an agricultural area, then undergoing a very strong transformation through a process of urbanization. It's where Saint Jean Hospital is. And the Botanical Garden, is in a better situation because it's being developed as a place to cultivate biodiversity in great style for at least 50 years. So this is quite promising. The Esprella network tries to introduce 2 new parks. One is already being built, and it's a very interesting space because we are in here creating opportunities for a wide number of species. Let's talk about more or less 7 hectares of new green spaces, taking advantage of already existing green spaces and species, and we can have a lot of increase in species because we are pushing them in. We are using the ones that already exist, and we are cultivating them more, particularly species who can engage well with the up-to-date tendencies of not using exotic invaders and work as much as we can with autochthonous species. In the southern area, we have another network of proximity green spaces around, again, the university, another university spot, where the Botanical Garden is on this left side. So this is the most interesting hotspot for cultivated species. Of course, as a Botanical Garden, we have been exercising here for a long time, like in any other botanical gardens of the world, to cultivate species from all of parts of the world. And in Porto is particularly interesting because all plants of the world can grow here. We don't have ecological limiting factors, and meaning that we can have a very high number of species in just 4 hectares. So the highest proportion of biodiversity actually occurs in the Botanical Garden. The challenge is all these cultivated spaces need extra energy being inputted by humans. And that's a challenge because to cope and to face the loss of biodiversity, we have to make extra effort to cultivate biodiversity and spend energy in promoting it and making the most of it with our knowledge, as we have been seeing in previous presentations. We haven't even exercised this tiny, humble little space with just half an hectare, using leftovers from the building construction. And we are promoting, in 10 years, we increase biodiversity in a very interesting situation from a rubble area without any special input. And by the help of people, particularly students, we rose the amount of species in a very interesting way. And we even have experienced biodiversity as a means of fun, recreation, and knowledge. So design is a way to manage and promote biodiversity in the city. And we have a lot of strategies we can share with you. One of them is a model to design, which is a model that has been inspired by, let's say, the direct observation human beings make of their pre-industrial agricultural systems or the natural systems, which has been very much practiced by the School of Landscape Architecture in Portugal, particularly the Évora School and the Lisbon School, which were the first schools and then spread all over the country, which is called the Clearing Edge Woodland Spatial Model, which is basically a matrix of spaces where they can combine in open spaces, transition spaces, and filled spaces with trees with completely different dynamics and completely different opportunities. The much you have this mosaic effect, the more, let's say, cultivated biodiversity you can have. So you can have these places where you can have herbaceous habitats, transition tree and shrub habitats, and tree habitats in a very small area. The more you do that, the more you increase the effect of biodiversity promotion and opportunities for habitats and even opportunities for activities. Humans tend to concentrate on this one, and around this one, we are animals of the clearing and animals of the edge, and all our activities are here. The problem is we want to put everything like that. We want to transform all the world in a massive clearing, and a massive clearing turning to pre-desert and even desert. So we cannot live in deserts with the amount of population we have. So all this model is following the trend of trying to cope the loss of biodiversity with the need to accommodate humans at this large proportion on Earth. So we have another strategy, which is layering, which is the edge effect. take advantage of the multi-layered structures we can plant. So we can force plants to live together and cultivate lots of layers of plants together and increase the ecological niches in very small spaces. This is the case of the famous mixed borders or border systems. This is nothing new again. They have been used for centuries in the agricultural fields, on the edge of the agricultural fields, and even in gardens they become a very important structure and effect in most of the gardens, particularly in the turn of the 20th century to the 19th century to 20th century. Another strategy is also adding water. Adding water is just, the miracle, You have the ducklings and the newts all together in very small ponds, and you can increase the opportunities for cultivated biodiversity very, very easily, and at the same time provide opportunities for humans to interact and learn. Of course, the group, the target group that has been addressed here already, which are the amphibians, very important. But again, as cultivated biodiversity even poses us a lot of challenges. Amphibians don't go along well with fish and don't go well with ducklings. So these ducklings you saw here, they just particularly ate all the plants and all the amphibians in one pond. So this poses us challenges when we cultivate biodiversity or conserve biodiversity, because things are not so easy and we have to be very knowledgeable and very finely tuned with the web of life so we can have them nearby us without just having one type of things. So another strategy is also to play with geological features and to, create all sorts of habitats with rocks and rubble you have lefting over from construction, and with that create shelter for all sorts of small reptiles and small rodents and even small birds. And also the possibility of creating constructed elements at a very small scale and increase microclimate spots that can promote this biodiversity. The typical greenhouse, of course, is a small greenhouse of the Botanical Garden of Porto, and this greenhouse is, has very well stocked with species, but at the same time you can do that everywhere you go. And also, and this is most important, we are particularly interested in that in the Botanical Garden, is to allow leaf litter and dead wood to rot on site and actually perform and help the cycle of the fungi and the cycle of life and nutrients and organic matter, and also to mulch and to create habitats for longer cycle insects. And also, they provide all sorts of information and all sorts of sculptural experience of the space. Of course, this creates another type of mosaic, another type of opportunity, keeping things on site, taking advantage of the life cycles on site, and of course have a very interesting pattern that can be understood and experienced by people. The same, and following my previous colleague with his sexy presentation, I must say, we also have to go and talk about the pollinators. And the pollinators, which are now particularly high in our attention, they have always been there and they have always been important, but now people, and particularly urban people, look at them in a particular way and try to understand them as much as possible. We have all sorts of things like the butterfly gardens and the butterfly exhibitions. I even saw a terrible exhibition, 7 years ago in Tate Modern, where these artists, very famous artist, Damien something, I don't remember the name anymore, was using this massive room where he stocked with butterflies, and we went in to experience ourselves with the butterflies alive. They're also being replaced, and this is the opposite of the celebration of biodiversity, the celebration of death, in a way. Anyway, so another strategy is to play and engage ourselves with nativeness and native species. And these native species can occur anywhere. You can have wild orchids on a lawn of the university, and by manipulating mowing regimes, you can have all sorts of excitement, all sorts of diversity at a very, very low cost. So this is the type of biodiversity we can have, but another biodiversity nearby our cities is emerging, and this is the biodiversity of the big players, the biodiversity of those who have always played a long, important role in our conservation attention, in our conservation worries. They are now coming to town and living with us. They're living on the garbage, on the streets, and they eat. And some of them eat rabbits and the rodents and garbage, and others, just the one on the right side, eats infant babies. Because we are encroaching so much, leopards in Mumbai also chase young children, dogs and cats in streets because we encroach in his environment. And bears feed until they wait for the next glaciation. They come to dump us and enjoy themselves. So it's not a real way to deal with this situation. And dealing with biodiversity is not just a garden story. It's a story we need to engage ourselves in a much more important and much more aggressive attitude. So it's not negotiable. We have to move, and we have to move like that. We have to zone, we have to plan, we have to design, we have to work with biodiversity just the way we work with planes. My car, I didn't pay attention to the pieces I was losing in my car, and it stopped in the middle of the highway when I was coming to Lisbon. Now, if we don't take care, and if we don't pay attention to this situation, if we don't integrate, segregate, accommodate, harmonize, compensate, and accept. And what we have to do, we have to dissipate the conflict between ourselves, which is not necessarily natural, it is artificial. This is the only way we can cope with this situation of having so many human beings and viable human beings. So let's carry on doing it. It's a tiny fraction of the earth which has been developed under these procedures of biodiversity cultivation with all other principles of sustainability, but I think we can get there. So let's the work progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, And now we move to the oceans. So for that, I'd like to present Emmanuel Gonçalves from the Blue Ocean Foundation with a communication on biodiversity and the new blue economy.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be here with you today in my name and the name of the Oceano Azul Foundation. And thank you also for the opportunity to talk about the 97% of the territory in the case of Portugal, which is the ocean. And I would like to invite you to start by watching a video that the Oceano Azul Foundation recently launched that we believe it speaks for itself. So we are facing unprecedented challenges, of which the current pandemics is just the latest battlefield. And we have learned some lessons from these pandemics, and I would like to highlight the following. One is that destroying nature has direct consequences for humans. This is clearer than ever today. We also understand that we need science because we need to solve these challenges, and these challenges are difficult, but this science is fundamental to support policies for change. And there is this sense also that possibly nature is coming back because we're seeing these weird images of animals in our cities and in places where they weren't before. But is it? Is nature coming back? Well, we don't know the answer for that question right now because there's lots of science being done on the impacts of the current pandemics on wildlife. But there are a couple of things that we do know. We know that we are facing a climate emergency, and we know that we are facing a species extinction crisis. And the previous speakers have already talked about this. So the science is clear on this. There is no doubt about these two challenges. And if you are to take one message from this talk, please take this one. We know. We don't have the benefit of the previous generations of ignorance, of not knowing what we are doing. We know that we are destroying the planet. So if we continue to do so, it's because we choose to do so. Let me bring you an ocean perspective on this topic. So this is the impact on climate change on oceans. The ocean has been our safe net because 90% of the excess heat is in the ocean. If it was not for the ocean, the planet will be inhabitable already. A quarter of all the CO2 is coming to the ocean as well. And because of that, the ocean is becoming more acidic. And so we have a cascading effects that you see there, from habitat change to acidification to bleaching of corals that have a known cause. We know what is impacting the ocean. And so since we know, what are we doing about this? Where are we heading? Well, we have the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement has concrete targets, but this is where we are heading. This is the business as usual scenario where we are today. And in spite of the fact that we know that we have to come here if we are to stay under safe limits of the planet. And we also know another thing, and this is the reason why you have an emergency, is that we have very little time to be able to achieve this target. We have 1 decade to keep within the 1.5 degree target of the Paris Agreement. If we overshoot this target, we will have a completely different planet in front of us. So whatever we're going to do in the next 10 years matters for the next centuries. And this is also something that we should keep in mind. And in terms of the ocean, we already know that the impacts that we have today are overwhelming in some cases. With 1 degree where we are over here, you already see that coral reefs are being heavily impacted. Half of those coral reefs are gone. If we stay under 1.5, we're going to have to lose probably around 80 to 90% of those coral reefs. If we overshoot that, they're gone. 30% of the marine biodiversity are on these ecosystems. But if you can see also that it's not just coral reefs, it's a suite of other habitats that support ocean life that are going to be impacted if we don't stop warming. The other message that I would like to leave here today is the word crisis when we talk about species extinction. And in the case of the ocean, usually we have this imaginary that the ocean is too big to be impacted by our human activities. Well, this map tells us otherwise. Okay? What is striking here is not just the reds that you see, which is areas with very high impact. is all the orange that are around here and yellows all over the ocean. In fact, science shows us that only around 30% of the ocean is still intact. So preserving what's left is a big priority for today, but it's not enough. It's not nearly enough, because we need to restore what we have taken, and so we need to rewild the ocean as well. And so if we want to sum up the impact of the oceans, of the humans on the oceans in the last 100 years, we can use this cartoon, where in the beginning of last century, we had an ocean filled of fish with a few fishers exploiting it sustainably, and now we have an ocean filled of fishers without no fish. And this is backed by science. So all the indicators we have at the global scale show us a big decline, and climate change is worsening the situation. And depending on where we will end up in terms of the climate curves, we will also have different impacts on the biomass of the ocean in terms of food. So again, we know we have enough information to act. So what are we going to do about this? What are the solutions that we could put on the table? There are two things that we all know that we need to do. We need to decarbonize the economy, and this needs to happen right now. But we also need to rebuild nature, also in the oceans. We need to put the fish back where they are. So in terms of decarbonizing the economy, how can the ocean help to try to fill the gap that we have over here, which is where we need to go and where we are heading? The oceans can help with a number of solutions, and these solutions are rooted in the economic model that we have today that needs to change. We can use nature-based solutions to help fight climate change, such as rebuilding salt marshes, rebuilding seagrass beds, rebuilding biomass in the ocean. We need to change the way we carry our goods through the ocean in green shipping. We can use energy, and we can rebuild the biomass of the ocean. So all these things together, and this is a study from the high-level panel, adds up to around 20% of the gap that can be filled from the oceans immediately if we decide to do so. We have other solutions that we know that work. We know that marine protected areas work. They allow us to protect the last wild places in the oceans, but they also allow us to rebuild nature. However, in spite of the fact that these tools are known by scientists and these tools are known by politicians for a long time, we only have around 5% of the ocean protected, of which only 2% is fully protected, which means that only on 2% we have the integrity of the system working. The good news is that it works. We know this. We know that when we protect these areas, we'll have more fish, larger fish, more species, and we also know that these fish are going to move around. So they can feed the economy, they can feed fisheries if we have enough of the ocean protected. Let me give you 3 examples of what the Oceano Azul Foundation is doing in terms of these solutions. One is the Blue Azores program, which is an initiative from our foundation together with the Waite Institute and the Waite Foundation and the government of the Azores, where these 3 partners came with this common vision of protecting, promoting, and value the blue natural capital of the Azores, with a commitment of achieving 150,000 square kilometers of fully protected areas in the Azores. This is a major achievement for Europe if we are able to succeed. Europe has less than 1% of that, and Portugal has around 4% of this protection will mean around 4% of that for Europe as a whole. The second initiative that I would like to briefly talk to you about is on the economic side. Because if we have all this wealth in the ocean, if we have all this biodiversity, we know that from this biodiversity, we can extract solutions for the new economy. We can extract solutions for the economy that decarbonizes, and we can extract solutions for the economy that protects this natural capital. And this Blue Bio Value Program, an initiative between the Oceano Azul Foundation and the Gulbenkian Foundation, where we are, which is aiming at showing that this is possible. And then rallying together the other parties, the government of Portugal for sure, and the civil society and private businesses, to show that we can build the bioeconomy of the future. And in Portugal in particular, we have both the natural capital and human capital to do this. We have the brains, and we have the fish and the biodiversity that's in the ocean. So we can do this if we choose to do so, and we are trying to help in that path. And finally, the third initiative that I would like to bring to you is this global coalition for the solutions to save the ocean and to put the ocean in the path of the future. And this is a Rise Up, which is the video I've shown you in the beginning of the talk, where more than 400 organizations are already behind this. We have delivered this to the United Nations, to the United Nations General Secretary, and we want this to be a big player in the future of the solutions. So I'll conclude by going back to my cartoon that we know, and leaving a question for us to answer, which is the following. We know this for a while. This is not new. We know that we are destroying the planet since a long time ago. Climate scientists have been trying to talk to politicians about this and to the society at large for more than 30 or 40 years. So if we know what we are doing, and if we have solutions for solving these problems, why aren't we more successful in doing so? And for sure, the reason for this is because of us. We are not willing to rally around those solutions. We are moving too slow. We are not doing this in an integrated way. We don't like that message. And so this is all about the message and us. And so I would like to finish by leaving this challenge to all of you. What are you going to do about this? Thank you very much.
Last but not least, we will have Helena Freitas from Universidade de Coimbra with a presentation on biodiversity and the new green economy.
Bom dia. Eu gostava de agradecer o convite. I would like to thank the invitation to join the launching of the European Green Week. Just a few words in Portuguese, I apologize, as I'm in Lisbon, and it's a great pleasure for me to be in Lisbon. My job, or I must say my challenge today, is to bring up some of the policies that might hopefully help us to prevent the loss of biodiversity and the loss of nature. I hope I can at least bring up some of these issues and help us in the discussion that we'll have in the round table. So, a number of very quickly through a number of definitions that we all know already, but just to emphasize some of them. Biodiversity, of course, we know what is biodiversity, and we are very much aware of what is happening and the numbers and the figures that have already been shown by some of us. But we should maybe start by discussing further the role of the so-called ecosystem services that have been also presented over the morning. And ecosystem services are the benefits people obtain from ecosystems. And according to a very short definition of the so-called Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, ecosystem services can be classified as provisional, regulative, supportive, and cultural. So I would like also to show you another definition of this ecosystem service that we call nature contributions to people. And these are all the contributions, both positive and negative, of living nature, diversity of organisms, ecosystems, and their associated ecological and evolution by processes. So these definitions are very important, and they should be more and more part of our lexicon. And why? Because biodiversity and nature contributions to people sound to many people academic and far removed from our daily lives. But nothing could be further from the truth. They are the bedrock of our food, clean water, and energy. And I believe, this concept has also been addressed by some of the previous speakers. But we must act to halt and reverse the unsustainable use of nature, or it's not only the future we want, but even the lives we currently lead. Fortunately, the evidence also shows that we know how to protect and partially restore our vital natural assets. So what are the ecosystem services? This is also a very conceptual framework that we would like to use because it's after the IPBs. And ecosystems and biodiversity, the functional traits and all the biotic interactions, species richness, genetic biodiversity, these are all the constellation of aspects that are connected to biodiversity, and they are driving ecosystem services and the change, the benefits and the value for societies. But conservation of ecosystems and biodiversity is the foundation of a sustainable economy. Because of these services, water, food, shelter, and energy are the building blocks upon which life and economic systems are built. The resilience of the global economy is linked to the state of the environment. So we need to push a closer alignment of our economy and environmental systems, and that is our most important challenge. How to align it? We have a number of examples of what is happening with the ecosystems degradation and degradation of ecosystem services in general. We know by now the direct drivers and the indirect drivers of ecosystem services degradation, and some of the examples are quite striking. Like 50% of ecosystems' extended condition are declining, species extinction, ecological communities, the biotic integrity. And just an example, an amazing and very impressive figure, because we are losing biomass and species abundance at a rate that is really impossible, sometimes looks impossible to prevent. Another figure that is from a very recent report of WWF and IOL on the so-called Global Living Planet Index shows us a very striking decrease of life on Earth. It's very impressive because we are not only losing the number of species, ecosystem services, we are also losing the integrity of populations, communities. Is it possible still to repair this damage, all this damage? I'm not sure, but I want at least to give it a chance, and I think all of us, because we need it to go on. And how can we do it? What are the political schemes? What are the policies that we have in front of us that can help us to prevent it? And this is, you can see that up to now we have essentially for the global biodiversity conservation financing, we have domestic budgets and tax policy, and we have a number of other activities that somehow support the global financing worldwide. But essentially, up to now, this is the big part of it. But we also know that we are still subsidizing a number of harmful policies for biodiversity and for biodiversity conservation. Unless we stop agriculture subsidies, forestry subsidies, fisheries subsidies, unless we manage to stop these subsidies, or we won't achieve the goals we want to prevent the loss of biodiversity. That is very clear. But it's not easy for any politician, for any international policy or national policy. This is a big challenge. How can we do it? Well, we have to close the gap, and we need government actions. Governments need to do more to protect natural capital and put in place a combination of policy reforms to reduce negative impacts on biodiversity, such as reforming harmful agriculture subsidies and reducing investment risk by public and private investors. This is a big challenge, of course, but we need new financial innovations. It's all the funding and the financing system that has to change with us. And we need to have more funding schemes available for funding conservation, promoting green investments, and supporting development of nature-based solutions, natural infrastructures, and biodiversity offsets. Of course, the private sector has to go on with us, with the public sector, and the private sector can play a pivotal role, as we have seen the foundations before, some of the foundations at the foundation where we are at now. But the governments need to pave the way. The governments need to pave the way for private investments. Governments need to put in place the right regulatory environment, smart incentives and market structures to catalyze the financial flows from the private sector into biodiversity conservation. Besides, the only way to stop global biodiversity loss is to ensure that nature is appropriately valued in all economies. And this will require political leadership and transformative policies, mechanisms, incentives that discourage harmful actions and encourage large-scale finance of nature. It seems that we are facing this new momentum in Europe, and we have to benefit from it. We have to push it as much as we can. And I'm happy to see here in the room Humberto Rosa, which is one of probably our best ambassador in the European Union in promoting this agenda, and he's doing a tremendous job, really pushing the agenda of biodiversity. It's very important. His role is very important. Thank you. Of course, we also know, and we have been discussing this morning, the role of protecting and conserving areas. Of course, our big target to have from the Global Biodiversity Framework and European policy is to push the conservation to 30% of the planet by 2030. This is amazing, and this target has to be achieved, but it's not easy, but it's a target that we should all support, including in both inland and water protection. We need to go and to push this agenda of territories protection. And maybe one day, and I have the same dream of E.O. Wilson, to protect one day 50% of the planet. Who knows? 5 years ago, it was more than a dream. But now it seems it's closing, it's getting close. But of course, the big challenge, is to green the world economy by encouraging governments to mainstream environmental values, invest in ecosystem services, and use nature-based solutions to pressing social and environmental challenges. This is, our challenge, and I very much like this figure of the IUCN, and I think they are doing a great job pushing this agenda of the nature-based solutions. How are we going to do it? Well, nature-based solutions are actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural and modified ecosystems in ways that address societal changes effectively and adaptively to provide both human well-being and biodiversity benefits. These are a couple of examples from mountains, forests and watersheds, rivers and wetlands, farmlands, cities, coasts, a number of, some of the examples, a loss that we can really, how can we do, what can we do, and what are the examples of projects that we have to produce, of course, bringing up more knowledge, networks, involving as much as we can the private and the public sector, and come up with projects of this time, because at the same time they protect nature, they provide ecosystem services, and they build the nature, the green agenda for the ecological transition that we want to achieve. And while we are promoting nature-based solutions, ecosystem services, we are also improving the societal agenda of well-being worldwide. We are also contributing for zero hunger, one of the 2030 Agenda objectives, the Sustainable Development Goals. This is a common agenda. As much as we protect nature, as much as we protect ecosystem services, as much as we come up with nature-based solutions, we are not only protecting nature, we are protecting people, and we are contributing for a different world, where we truly manage to achieve the goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. Nothing can be more important for humankind. But of course, there are a number of other connections that we could do from these nature-based solutions, ecosystem services, and some of them have been already discussed, so I will skip them. But of course, as much as we work for adaptation for biodiversity, we increase connectivity, we fight climate change, fire regimes. So this is a puzzle that will work more and more well together. But of course, what do we have as policies? Well, the so-called green economy. We have the Green New Deal, and this is a fantastic agenda that the European Union produced recently, and that we are all involved, all the European countries, in this fantastic new Green Deal agenda. We have to push it and to join it. Citizens, institutions, universities, everybody has to join it. And well, we could discuss green growth, degrowth. Of course, this is also part of the balance, and we should keep this balance. Of course, we should keep the idea of degrowth. Can we go for it? Probably not. But we have the Green New Deal, which is a balanced policy that, of course, based on this axis, carbon tax, high energy efficiency, renewable energy, and then we can also bring consumption. What can we do further to further involve other consumption strategies? But we have, of course, this transition has to be just, socially just, so we have to involve and to include the concern with jobs and job loss. The European Green Deal, and some of these are the programs of the European Green Deal, they are all extremely relevant for biodiversity to safeguard and ecosystem services. And this is the basics of the EU economy, and I believe this is going to be our agenda, our political agenda. I hope so. And with this agenda, by building up this agenda, we will more and more, I mean, even if I do have the same sense of urgency that we all share this morning, I'm not sure if it's enough, but we don't have any other way. So we have to progress with the instruments that we have. And the major and the best instrument to manage to build is the Green Deal agenda. And I believe we should support it as the agenda that we have to prevent the loss of biodiversity and I mean the future, I hope. Well, just a very short and last messages. I really like this diagram from the recent report just last week. I think these key messages are extremely relevant, and the fact is that while we are losing biodiversity, we are also losing, and the pandemic is really showing us the brutal effect of this disruption of the planet, and that we are witnessing a huge loss jobs, and we are exacerbating inequality and poverty. This has to be part of our agenda too, because we won't gain, we won't save biodiversity if we don't face the inequality and the injustice that is, and the poverty. This has to be part of our biodiversity agenda. Because if you protect biodiversity, if you have an eye over biodiversity, if you protect the butterfly, you have the intelligence to support humanity. That is very clear. So this has to go together. The agenda of the people and society, justice, inequality, in the fight of inequality has to go together with the biodiversity agenda. And we have a number of messages that we can, of course, read, and I would like just to finish with all of them, because I think all of them are part of what we call the green economy that will hopefully bring up a new world. Thank you very much.
Okay, so now I think it's the time, now it's the time to have the round table. So I will ask to all the speakers to come here. So, Milena, can you start? Okay, so I have a difficult task. So first of all, thank you and welcome to the roundtable of session 1 of this conference. And first of all, I'd like to, in the name of the organizers, in particular the Lisbon Municipality and Lisbon, the European Green Capital, to thank to all of you for the excellent talks. And so this is why it's going to be relatively easy, I hope, the roundtable and the discussion that we are going to have. So just to everyone to know how this is going to work. So this roundtable will have 3 moments. The first one I will ask to the people here, to the speakers, to have 4 minutes each contribution. So in total, I hope to have like 25 minutes. And followed by 10 minutes where the public, not only in the audience, but everyone can put some questions, and I will try, with the help of Ruben Oliveira, to try to answer to some of them. And finally, we'll have another 10 minutes with a second round, very short, just for a final ending round. So for the first one, and I'd like to divide this group in 2. So I will start with Miguel, with Ruben, and with Paulo. The question, it's the topic. So it's true that what it has been done is far from necessary. Biodiversity continues to decline in many regions of the planet due to unsustainable agriculture practices, either due to excess or abandonment, to urban expansion and pressure, to pollution, especially from water lines, and also affected by dams, invasive species, so much more. In view of the consecutive postponement of objectives and targets, how realistic do you think that the UN and the European Commission agendas to reverse this decline by 2030? How realistic do you really think it is, since we are already in 2020? So, whenever you want to start, maybe Miguel?
Thank you. Can you hear? Yeah. Well, realism I think we have to distinguish two kinds of realism. Realism in the targets themselves. Are they sufficiently realistic to stop biodiversity decline in itself? And the second aspect, which I think is what you asked, is whether we will be able to achieve the targets that we set for ourselves. I think the first question is that, are the targets realistic? And I think, given what we know, they're not. As we speak, there's degradation of biodiversity in the jewels of the world. The most precious areas of biodiversity are being destroyed as we speak. So the speed with which destruction is happening and the speed with which we respond to them is not equivalent. So that's the first level of realism. But the second level of realism, I'm more optimistic. If we look back, you might be skeptical and say, well, we failed the 2010 targets. We failed the 2020 targets. Why would we not fail the 2030 targets? And of course, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think there's a momentum now, as this has been referred. Never as before, the environment has been so high in the political agenda. Biodiversity is back to the political agenda. It's been away from the political agenda since shortly after the Rio Convention in 1992. It's back now. It's intertwined closely with climate change agenda, which of course is much more in the public discourse than biodiversity is. So they're now held together. So that's good. And there's money attached to these commitments. So, in a way, I think there's now what we have to do is to be wiser than we've been before in implementing these measures. And I think whether it will happen or not, it depends on all of us. So if you ask us, is it realistic? Well, I hope so. I hope so. I don't think we should conceive not being serious about meeting those targets by 2030.
Okay. Thank you. And you, Ruben, what do you think?
Well, I'd like to be more optimistic about that, but sadly, I think we have very little scientific base to be more optimistic or as optimistic as I would like to. If we think about our human footprint, it's obviously the result of the two multiplicative factors, which is how many of us there are and our per capita consumption. And to curb the population growth, we would need, of course, education, change economies that become less extractive, and that's already something very difficult. But then, thinking more about Europe, what we would need to do is to reduce the per capita consumption, and that's not something that we are seeing happening. Most of us have jobs so that we can consume more. We're trained to consume, and the companies are very good at giving us different options. So it's relatively easy for industry to change from giving us normal food full of pesticides to organic food. That's a transition that can be made because it's just changing the product they're selling to us, but no industry in the world or no person in the world, well, the persons might want to, but it's very difficult to see it as a global scale, want to consume less. So industry can change, but it's not enough to consume less. And what we see is that even the countries that have the better environmental conscience in the world, they're still consuming the resources of the earth at a faster speed that the earth can recover from them. So we're not seeing a very good leadership from the people that know, like we've seen. I mean, we know, and we're still consuming more than the earth could give. So I don't see a lot of solid reasons to be optimistic.
So in your perspective, the time is really against?
Yeah, I think so.
Paulo?
Yes, I don't believe that. I think targets are stimulators, are teasers for politicians and decision makers and for all of us. But in the end, what we see is that we're not paying enough for those who produce more, for those who make the effort, for all ourselves. And just like the presentation of Elena has done immediately before we talk here, we see that if we don't take care of equity, if we don't take care of the social problem, if we don't take care of the human beings, we won't be able to tackle biodiversity. It'll be absolutely impossible. If you're not paying fair enough to fishermen, if you're not paying fair enough to a group of primary producers like the rural people, agriculturalists, we won't make it. And of course, we're all consuming, as you're saying, immensely. I suspect all these targets will be met by a certain type of war, like the war we are living now, like the war of the collapse of the society. We are encroaching in the natural system, and the natural system is paying back. So we are infected. So that's what's going to happen if we don't stop, unless we put effort, energy, and politics on that. We have to bring ideology back again to our lives, and we have to be very strict on that. And that's a challenge. Otherwise, it's just a work for scientists, economists, and we invent word after word. We go from sustainability to circular economy and all that, and we have to give effort back to the populations we are actually producing the lettuces, the wheat, the fisheries, the planet. The problem is not what are we doing for the planet. If we don't, it's not negotiable. We are actually destroying the planet. We are destroying ourselves. And what we are seeing now, look at us in masks. So I don't think it's really realistic to accept that target for 2030.
I didn't consider, I was thinking to go directly to the second question, but maybe because we tickle and we approach this economic, let's say, ideas. So do you want to, both of you, Emmanuel and Elena, to contribute with since your conferences were about economy? You do not have one?
I don't have one. If I can use yours.
You have?
No, because mine is different. Maybe you have another
Did
one. Maybe you are seated.
Oh, God. Sorry, this one you can use it.
You know the story of the
Sorry.
princess and the bean?
Yeah, okay, sorry. Well, I am the
No.
moderator, so...
No, but thank you, because I do think this is an important question, and I share what has been said, but it's even though it's not really very high, the signal, we can notice some trend in the sense of decoupling the growth from the consumption of natural resources. It's really tiny, but we have it. This is a positive sign. Maybe I tend to be a bit more positive, even though I understand what has been said, and I strongly support the idea that we have somehow, we doing science, we have to do more politics. That is clear to me. We have to be more engaged with policies, and we have to show the impact of policies in biodiversity, but also in well-being of societies in general, because we are losing the planet, but most of all, we are losing the capacity to respond to people's needs. And if people are the problem, people have to be the solution. So we have to come up with solutions that are also initiatives of the people and societies. We cannot respond to this huge problem without really involving societies and communities worldwide. This is, but it's a big challenge, and I understand, and I realize, and I support this idea that it's a tremendous challenge, and we are not really responding as much, and the speed we need, the urgency we need. But there are some signs, and when we have such a strong narrative at the European level as the Green Deal, even though, we have to balance it better with degrowth policies, of course we have deconsumption and restraining consumption of natural resources, and the food system is a huge transformation that we have to start, I'm sorry, but just to say and finish, I finish with this message. I'm sorry, I will just...
Manuel. One
Yeah.
minute.
Well, very, very shortly, I'm mildly optimistic. I think that the changes that we are seeing, not at the global scale, but talking about Europe, are giving us some hope that we are starting to move into the right direction. So we need this to be very science-based approach, and this is probably somewhat lacking in the strategy, but there's some signs that science is coming to policy more and more. But mainly we need to pass this down to governments to make this very clear and sharp line between the activities that carbonize and destroy nature and those that decarbonize and preserve nature. Mm-hmm. And it has to be expensive to be on the side that carbonizes and destroys nature, and you have to be able to have a living on the other side, and the incentives have to be there. And this is not rocket science in this sense. Of course, it's politics, it's complicated, but again, we have solutions. The will seems to be changing, and my final word would be for the youth. I think the youth is the one which is putting ourselves on the spotlight, and it gives me hope that these changes will happen. The real question is that we are running out of time, and are we going to do this quickly enough?
Okay, so thank you for this first question. I think that I could identify some keywords. So we have the wiser motivation. We need to be wise. We need to be quick. Maybe we do not have time. Maybe the targets are a little bit difficult, but we need to include the people, and we need to be more inclusive in terms of areas. So before I go to the public, maybe I will start now with Elena and Emmanuel, because in fact, and we have been talking a lot about ecosystem services, and we know the scientific community that they are there, but sometimes they are difficult to disseminate, and particularly for the society in the daily activity, it's not an easy task to include them. So this concept that is so important and that we use to quantify the value in euros to benefits that ecosystems provide us in our economy, what do you think in terms of what have been, or there have been some efforts to get this concept into account in the economy, but little determination to make it visible and better so far? So in your perspective, what importance do you attribute to a greater entrenchment of the concept of ecosystem services in our society and in the economy? Is it something that we can change the mindsets? What power does literacy have in the success of these agendas? How can we really do it? Because we speak a lot, and Miguel, I think, mentioned about, or some of you mentioned, sometimes we talk about the subject too many times. But how really do you think that we could include, or what is your perspective to include these that born exactly to help economy, to be included in the economy? How can we do it?
I call your attention for a report that was just came out maybe 4 or 5 days ago from the Swiss banking system exactly on this issue, and how can we, and this is a very important report, I think strategic, because it's showing us this connection between the future of the countries in terms of their economies and the financing system, and the solution and the ecosystem services, and how far the economies of different countries, and it's country by country, is connected to the biodiversity safeguard in these countries. And like more than 50% of the economies are already based on the support of ecosystem services. So more and more we'll have different players that are essential to bring in this biodiversity global agenda. And these players are the banking system, the markets, the big companies, of course, and we have, it's relevant. We have a lot of big companies that are trying to incorporate in their agenda, in their development plans, the protection of biodiversity and the role of these nature-based solutions or ecosystem services, you can call it, or natural capital. And when we will soon have, this is very important because we'll have a change from the GDP typical and classical instrument, conventional instrument for evaluation of the economies. We will add other criteria to evaluate the capacity and the future of the countries. And this is going to play, in my opinion, a huge role, helping us to incorporate this natural capital and nature-based solutions. I don't like the term natural capital, but well, nature in the political agendas, because the solutions are there, and we have the knowledge and the solutions. We just have to support, and the governments and the public policies have to pave the way for private investors to do it. We can do it. Maybe we will lose a lot of biodiversity still because we are not fast, we are not quick enough in terms of responding. Maybe, unfortunately, we will lose a lot of people and societies, communities. Indigenous communities are losing the capacity to survive. And this is our fault. We are losing because we are losing these people and these connections.
So,
but there are a lot of political and economical instruments, and even the banking system, which I thought would be taking more time, but it's not true. They are coming to the same agenda.
So we may have some demonstration, case studies. So, Emmanuel, do you want to?
One thing that I think it's critical is for us to realize that we have a broken economic system. And it's very hard for us to admit that we have a broken economic system, because this is when we will start thinking about, okay, what is the alternative to that broken economic system? And in the end, we are only going to be able to bring all this notion of nature to the economy if we think and if we realize that nature and the economy are the same side of the same coin. They are not even different sides of that coin. They are the same side of the same coin. Meaning that these concepts have to arrive to the spreadsheets of CEOs. They have to arrive to the cost-benefit analysis of decision makers. On those spreadsheets, on those cost-benefit analyses, we need to have these things that we are talking about. We need to have, is those activities going to impact on nature, or are they going to save nature? Are those activities going to decarbonize the economy, or to continue in the old economy? When we arrive there, then I think we will be in the right direction. And just to finish, I must tell you that the fact that in the European Union we have a natural capital unit, and Humberto is here, I think it's very inspiring in the sense that we are moving into that direction, and the economy of the environment is definitely going to be the economy of the future.
Okay. I'm going to ask to my three colleagues shortly to comment on this.
When I was young, it was fashionable to talk about amongst some circles that in order to solve society's problems, we needed a new man. I've always been very skeptical about the new man because, you know, if you observe our behaviors, we're not very different from the out of Africa Homo sapiens many thousands years ago, and we're not very different from the caveman that lived in Europe as well. So we, after all, we are the same animal. We have the same behavior. Having said that, society has changed. So the way we organize ourselves has changed, and it can change. So rather than a new man, What we need is a new society. And that can be modulated, that can be. But we just need to understand it a little bit better. And with the tools that we have, interfere with it. I like to think of, and I agree with Ruben that consumption is the big problem, which is associated with human population density as well. But in our world, in our part of the world, per capita consumption is a target because we are already degrowing in terms of population. So it's really about how much we consume. But we have to realize that historically, there's two sets of behavior for consumption. When we are poor, we are hungry, we want to consume more because we need to achieve that level of protein that we need to be healthy. Once we've achieved that level, we switch from quantity to quality. We want to consume better food, more fashionable food, more diverse food, which has usually a greater human footprint. But we're now entering a third wave. And that is, I think, is fundamental to recognize. The postmodern, shall we say, the postmodern human of Europe and the United States does not only care about quantity and quality, but also about how that products were made, where do they come from, how do they impact in the environment. So that is a movement that is already happening. You might question, how important is it, right? But that's not the right question. The right question is how can we empower that movement? And empowering the consumer to make wiser choices implies greater access to information. So if I go to the supermarket and I want to buy my cereals, I just gave the example of the cereals, it's a lot of trouble to get the right cereals that don't have the oil palm. I have to read very, very small letters, and my eyes are not what they used to be. So it's work. And I'm a relatively well-informed consumer. So that cannot be. I mean, when we go and shop for clothes, for food, certification is fundamental. And now the two big questions is climate and biodiversity. There has to be a certification for climate impacts. The carbon cycle, how much carbon was used to produce and transport that product. And for biodiversity, what's the imprint? I mean, does this product come from a recently deforested Amazonian rainforest, or it comes from a very old farm that even includes some biodiversity in it? So that's from the demand side. Then there's the supply side. The supply side it responds to stimulus, right? If the consumer changes, the consumer behavior changes, the supply side will also adapt. But then governments can speed up the process, not just by imposing certification processes, but also by taxing differently what needs to be taxed differently. We have to penalize the ones that are damaging the future of life and the future of humanity, and we have to compensate those that are creating value, building on sustainability. So every incentive being a subsidy, as Elena was about the negative subsidies, or the tax system has to be modulated to try to foster good behaviors on society as a whole.
Ruben.
I fully agree with this view and the view of my colleagues, and maybe to be more positive than I was before, I recognize that we see these beacons of light and we see a pathway. That's already very good, because we could be heading for a catastrophe and completely lost, running and shouting and not knowing what to do. That's not the case. We recognize the problem, we see lines of action, and we know what we need to do, and there's already people starting to do that, and those movements are in place. Like we said, more information, and with fair trade, markets, shorter markets, that's all very positive and good. Now, the downside is that we're too slow to be doing that. We've been talking about ecosystem services and climate change for 40 years, and we should have done a lot more. I think we have all the tools and all the information to do a lot more, a lot faster, and we need to do that. To speed up that change. And the way to speed that change, I think it has to be to governments. This is not just to take the responsibility for my shoulders. Governments are still people, and it's still people that put governments in place. But because this common good, it's a common good that we need to manage, but it's not for the interest of the industry, and it's also not to the interest of the people, because most of the people want to consume more. Even when they want to consume better is more. So it has to be the governments to give them the information and the campaigns to educate how to consume better, not more.
But before Paulo, I would like just to call the attention that you didn't mention literacy. But for instance, Emmanuel mentioned that there is a need for instance, the CEOs know more about biodiversity. For instance, recently I found out that even big companies do not know the basic information about what is biodiversity, how can we protect, what are the actions to prevent the deterioration of biodiversity. I don't know if, Paulo, you want to finish this round with some comments?
I'd like to actually take on that and then absolutely agree with that. We are completely away, the players of the economy are completely away from this knowledge and away from these conceptions. So they don't understand when we talk about nature and economy, they think they are completely different worlds. Emmanuel was saying, it's not even the same side of the coin, it's the coin in itself. So if we don't, we have a problem in information and communication. So how many entrepreneurs or decision makers, bank owners are in this room? Where are these people? Maybe they are. You don't need to answer now. It's just to say that we need these people to be together with the knowledgeable, with the scientists. It's still very far away. We are fed up with these stories of the academics being completely kept away from power. We are the government. We are the voters. So all our responsibility is in our shoulders. So in that sense, we have to bring this message in a clearer way. And of course, we have to pay to those, as Miguel was saying, we have to pay to those who produce, we have to benefit those who are more integrated and willing to pay and to cope with this idea of living better, of being fairer. It's not about today we worry about climate change and tomorrow with biodiversity, we give some money to biodiversity. This idea of completely devised sections, it's impossible to cope with that. There is no future. So if we don't do that, if we don't change the political way, if we don't vote well, that's it. Let's allow the virus to solve the problem.
Okay, but this is why we are in Lisboa, European Green Capital. At least we know that we have involved a lot of governments, yes, a lot of institutions, and so that it's very good. So I would go now to two questions of the public. I'm not sure which of you could answer, but I will let you know. I will let you choose, sorry. So the question by Ukupaj: does citizens play a role on reporting the lack of biodiversity? Is the scientific community and politicians speaking with, for instance, farmers? This is interesting. Who wants to answer? There are two. The thing about the lack of biodiversity and then the lack of communication.
Can I just address the last question? Because okay. I think we've seen something very interesting. Perhaps I'm biased because of the world I live in, but I think more than environmentalists talking to farmers, there's now farmers that are environmentalists. And there's fantastic examples across this country, for example, yes, of farmers taking on board their responsibility and being innovative and providing not just like new ways of producing, but new ways of commercializing, new ways of transforming. I'm not going to name any because I'm not here in the business of doing marketing for them, but there's really attractive, exciting things going on in the rural areas, I think across Europe, but definitely here in Portugal. So I think that's very interesting. The farmers are becoming environmentalists. But, on the front line.
But just for question, because I had another round table 2 days ago, and it was a farmer. But are we giving enough space for those good examples? Do you think?
I think what we're still not giving is the right incentives.
Okay.
And I have, because in the end of the day, people respond to incentives.
Sure.
Negative incentives and positive incentives. And I think that's the way we can manage societies, by giving clear signals of where the road is going to be smoother and where the road is going to be harder. And that is in the hands of governments, for example, or the European Commission. And I think good steps are being given, and I'm really optimistic and interested in what's going to happen in the context of the Green Deal, because of course that is what is on the agenda, that kind of thinking.
Yeah, very good. So what about the first part? Does citizens play a role on reporting the lack of biodiversity? We are talking about this, Paul.
I think I've been forgetting one very important example, which is the example of the cities, and particularly the example of Lisbon. We pay regard to our host in here. Yes, because cities have been making a great job in actually promoting biodiversity. And, you know, applying all these measures are in the forefront of the implementation of all these measures. And of course, some of the spaces are not big, but the measures are big and they're influencing. And Lisbon has a long story of, let's say, green structure policy, which is now paying, and now we can see it. For instance, all these development around this area, this very place, which is a beacon of this type of attitude. So, places where human beings concentrate with the right policies or with the right idea, and of course alongside with the right knowledgeable people, they can do a great difference. And Lisbon is the case. And it's a story not of a rich country, not of a rich capital, but it makes difference and is influencing and inspiring the entire country and probably Europe as well. And other countries, we can go in Copenhagen from London and all that, and it is a difference. So a very positive example. It's not everything bad. It's getting better in cities. But on the other side of the world, on the other side of the continents where poor people live, it's not the same. And where the world actually is inhabited and makes a difference.
Well, it's good that Vereador Fernandes is here, this was not arranged, this question, by the way, but yes, I think that I totally agree with you. But there is another question by Raul Fred. Do we possess policy, infrastructure, tools or methods that enable policy and decision makers to evaluate and foresee the outcome of their actions policies? Elena, do you want to answer?
No, this is a very pertinent question, because this is one of the missing links. This is one of the things that we miss and we should have, but this is all for public policies in general. We tend not to assess the implementation of the public policies, whatever they are, and we tend to avoid even the evaluation of the impact of those policies. But fortunately, also this is going to change because of the public perception, the citizen participation in the processes. So more and more we tend to include in the public policy these mechanisms of following up the implementation of policies and assessing the impact of these policies, and the same is going to happen with environmental policy. So this is changing, but is certainly one of the issues, because it's connected, and this is important because it's connected to the governance, and that we have, if we want to achieve the targets, the environmental targets, and have the environment policy in the center of the global policy, we need to change the governance models. And we have in the room one of the big fighters for a change of this model, like Paulo with his Earth Condominium is one of the big fighters and we need to change, because of course we talk about leadership and the need for different leaders and leaders that promote environment and this challenge, but we also need models of governments that really have the environmental agenda in the center of the global policy. So this is one of the issues. But I would like to say, as for the cities, that in all the country, in Portugal, and I hope and I am sure that everywhere, cities are important players of the change, of this transition. And I know that you've been discussing, the last decade, you've been discussing with the mayor or the deputy mayor, as the case of Lisbon, you would be discussing which are the biodiversity assessment plans, but now you truly discuss where are the nature-based solutions, where are you going to restore the river wetlands or the salt marshes of Lisbon. I'm sure that you have in your plan, the mayor, the deputy mayor, I'm sure he has a plan for Lisbon for the next decade where he includes, certainly, the ecosystem services and the relevance of the green areas, the green infrastructure for the water system, the salt marshes to rebuild nature in the city of Lisbon. The same is happening in all the cities of Portugal, because this is part of this is a big change. We may not have noticed yet, but it's going to be, and there is a strong support for it. And as much as we have policies, again, like the one that Humberto is promoting at the European level, as much as we have these policies that are going to push the agenda for new forests, new farming systems. And by the way, farmers were always environmentalists. The farming systems changed it, but farmers were always environmentalists. Maybe.
Helena, thank you. Someone wants? Ruben?
Well, it's still talking about the farmers. I'd like to join my voice to the appraisal of farmers. Of course, that's very important. We have a lot of farmers that are trying to produce better products in a sustainable way. And whether those efforts will prosper or fail, ultimately it's decided in the supermarket shelf when we try to pick the cheapest product or the best product. And that's the ultimate minute where we say if they have a future or not. And we're consuming better. We're doing a great progress as consumers to identify those labels, and there's many different green labels that are valuable they deserve to get more money if they're doing the things right. And here it's where the governments can do more to make information more accessible to the consumer. I think we need more ways that the consumer, even if he doesn't want to, he takes an informed decision.
To say something, Miguel?
Yeah, I'd just to come back to the former question on the science policy interface. I think that's a critical question. We, as society, we're usually not very effective to deal with problems. We go by trial and error often. We try something. If it doesn't work, we go back and we do something else, and then we might go back again in cycles. But when we're facing an emergency like climate change or with the biodiversity loss, we have less opportunities for going wrong. The degrees of freedom to go wrong are reduced. It's the same with the pandemic. A wrong decision can cost immediately, after a few weeks, thousands of lives. So it becomes fairly obvious that we have to improve the quality of our decision making, and I can't conceive a system worse than not taking into account the best knowledge available to address big challenges with big emergencies like the pandemic, like climate change, like biodiversity. So how you do that in practice, we don't have time for that. But clearly, scientists, they're not decision makers. They should not be decision makers. They should not be the ones making decisions, clearly, because they're not trained to do that. But they have to be heard. They have to be involved in those processes. That's clear. Whether you do it by having science policy interface institutes, like, for example, the JRC systems in Europe, or you having advisors attached, for example, to the President of the European Commission. There has been a discussion earlier on about whether heads of governments, heads of big institutions should have a chief scientific officer to advise, just, of course, a generalist, someone with a high level, but could advise against gross mistakes and at least narrow down the range of possibilities of action. to the ones that are simply plausible scientifically, given the uncertainties, of course.
Thank you very much. Someone else, Emmanuel?
I would like to pick up on what Miguel just said and bring the topic of leadership. Because this is where, when we have these complex systems, complex challenges in a very short time, leadership is key. But many times leadership is, or can go as much as what society perceives as an emergency and supports those policies. And so these things are all connected. And literacy is a big aspect of the solutions, because we cannot have only the leaders pushing for those solutions if people don't understand why.
Sure.
And so if we think as a country like Portugal, that again, as I said, and that's my role here on this panel, 97% of our territory is ocean. We are an ocean giant. We are not a small country in Europe. We are an ocean giant. So why is the blue economy such a small part of our country? Because we don't have the three key things here. One is we need to be the most informed citizens on ocean topics in Europe. So we need to invest on education and literacy to make sure that people understand these connections. But we also need to be the champions on ocean protection, because we need to lead by example. We have a big responsibility. We have the natural capital here now, but we are losing it every day. And with that capital, what can it do? We can build a society, an economy, which is based on that value. Blue biotechnology is just an example of that, where we have the resource, we have the brains, we just need the investment to go into the right direction and the leadership to lead us. So all these things go together, and we can make this change happen. And if we do it, this new economy is also going to help us to solve the challenges of climate that we have discussed here today.
Well, I think that we could not hand any better this part. So I know that there are some more questions. Unfortunately, we do not have time, but I'd like to thank to the public and to all the questions that have been done. So to finalize, and this is going to be 2 minutes, something like this, round, just to end. I'd like to just end with this urgent problem to be tackled, that is the climate change that's reached a reputation that far exceeds the losses of biodiversity when we compare. However, we know that biodiversity is at the heart of the integrity of ecosystems and the full functioning of the cycles that regulate life on the planet. So what do you think that is the reason for this disparity in attention, or let's say fame, fashionable? What is the is it a temporal issue? I mean, is it because the IPCC reports precede, for instance, the International Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services? Or do you think that there is another reason? What is needed for the loss of biodiversity to reach the same prominence in the coming years as climate change? You can start.
Well, certainly we realize that we have to come into the political arena, because otherwise we won't manage to bring up these issues. So science has to come up and come into this political arena and bring the topic and bring biodiversity and bring the urgency to protect biodiversity and to come up with those solutions that we have. And the world needs scientists in the political arena more than ever. Not only because of the knowledge, but also because we have our principles.
Elena, let me to interrupt you. So this is, do you think it's because we didn't have enough scientists working with biodiversity in politics directly?
No, I mean, at this stage, it's essential. Because the urgency of the topic is, well, we all know that we have this decade. So if we don't come into the political arena, we won't manage to convince, because, well, we have to show not only our knowledge, but also, and science was never so important for humanity than it is now. Because we have the solution, we have the knowledge, and we have the tools we have the principles, and those principles of science are extremely relevant for our decade. We have the transparency of the way the scientific narrative pushes transparency, networking, collaborative work, leadership. These are the tools that we have to change the world. And we have 1 decade. So of course, we have to pursue our agenda of science, and we have to come up with more scientific solutions to respond to the problems, of course. But we have 10 years. We didn't, I mean, we lost a lot of time. So we have really to benefit from all the positions that we have and come up into the front line. And we have, because we have a narrative that is really a chance. I don't know if it's going to work, but we have this narrative that can at least give it a chance. So
Okay.
I have to push it. It's my responsibility. It's my, I mean, just to finish.
So maybe now, Emmanuel, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think that biodiversity is not perceived as a human problem. Climate is, because we see the changes. The plastics are, because we see that. But in general, for the general public, biodiversity is not perceived as such. So the real challenge here is how can we play with, as Miguel was saying, with the incentives, so that we drive the solutions into the direction where we can find a change in the economic system that will have this line on one side and the other. And at the same time that this happens, I think it's critical that we continue to inspire people by showing the wonders of nature. Because when people see life, they connect. And we need to see more and more of these, because we are becoming more and more an urban species. More and more of representatives of our species worldwide live in cities. They live disconnected with nature, in spite of the fact that many cities are making an effort now. So every chance we have of showing the people the beautiful images of wild animals in nature, it inspires them. And this is where the strength for change, for leaders to lead us into the right directions will come.
Emotion also. We need emotion.
Science and emotion. We need both at the same time, for sure.
Paulo.
Yes, I think scientists need to be more visible and participant in the society, and also try to communicate easier with the society. They need to go, again, for the forefront of the society in terms of business. They should be engaged in politics, they should be engaged in trade, they should be engaged in the firms. I think it'd be very good for the scientists to can work along with firms. Still, academics and economy are very much apart. The economy pays the academics to research, the academics research, then publish, and that's it, most of the cases. Only in real problems like we have today, sometimes they go to academics, sometimes they go to scientists. So if you don't put them together, working together, and scientists making their knowledge and their logics, their methodology visible and accessible to everyone, this message won't go further. And again, we have to put people in contact with nature. And of course, we're not going to put people, away from the cities where they live. So we have to bring again and make nature visible and make the problems of nature visible, and not just the sugary bit of nature. Nature in all its element, in all its possibility. And it's a big challenge, like in the oceans. Oceans are not a spectacle. They are economy. They are places where resources need to be managed and cherished. So if you don't do that, we won't go further. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Obviously, any agenda needs time to gain momentum. And with the climate change agenda, it's the same thing. It started 40 years ago, and then slowly, it started gaining momentum, and until it became something obvious that you don't need to explain what it is, everybody knows what it is. And I think the reason for that, because we already know about biodiversity issues also for the same time, but I think the reason was that climate change, like has been said, it's very visible, at least, for example, in Portugal, but anywhere. I mean, we saw the droughts, we saw firemen taking drinking water to people, and the rivers were dry, and we see the sand going away from the coasts and the houses falling into the sea. We see the fires. We see all of those things, and that becomes very, very close to us. That's why I think it gained more momentum. Now, what we need now, and for that, the pandemic kind of, I think it brought us this perspective, that we are part of a living world, and that not only we need to care with the climate change, that it's the abiotic part, but the biological change. I think if I'm allowed to have a dream, my dream is that we have this biological change should start to be something, because it's not only losing biodiversity, that's one side of biological change. There's many other parts of the puzzle, like invasive species, like fragmentation, like more monocultures, all of that, it's part of biological change. We completely change the way that species are organized in our planet, and now we are suffering from it. So now we need to put a biological change into the global agenda, I think.
Miguel.
Well, I think it's probably two things or more, but I think on the one hand we have a knowledge gap. We know a lot more about climate than we know about biodiversity. I mean, that's a fact. Biodiversity ecosystems are orders of magnitude more complex than the climate system, and the climate system is already pretty complex, but we're dealing with a handful of variables, whereas in biodiversity we don't even know how many variables there are. So clearly there's a knowledge gap in biodiversity, and if you don't understand biodiversity nearly as well as we understand, for example, the climate system, of course, then we can't communicate so well, because good communication implies good knowledge, synthesis. So for us, I like the distinction between complication and complexity, and for us, ecosystems still are complicated. Climate is complex. The difference is that in the complication we get lost in it. In the complexity we start understanding emergent properties. So, but then I think we utterly failed in the communication of biodiversity. Climate is easier to communicate, as it was already said, when we have a heat wave, and then we have many heat waves, and people die and we suffer. We understand what climate change means. When there's increased frequency of hurricanes and destruction and kills thousands of people and destroys cities and destroys forests, I mean, we know what that means very easily as well. So it's very sexy in a way in terms of communication. It's very easy. Biodiversity often is a silent process. You don't see it. Of course, you see these images of forests going away, but you're not there. You don't have this empathy with what was there before the forest was destroyed. I mean, the best communicators of my lifetime in terms of biodiversity was Felix Rodriguez de la Fuente and David Attenborough. In Spain and the UK, they strongly influenced my childhood, and they were talking to the heart. Of course, there was scientific knowledge, but they were fantastic communicators, because before anything, there was creating this empathy. And in the absence of a good knowledge about biodiversity, which, I mean, even the biggest experts in biodiversity, they just know a little tiny bit, let alone the lay people, right? So it's, communication will have to go through these processes of emotional connection, and perhaps because scientists they don't tend to do that, because what we do is the brain, not the heart, and so there's a mismatch there. That connection between people and knowledge is not so easily done, and I'm not sure whether the solution is for scientists to stop being scientists and becoming something else, politicians, entrepreneurs, and communicators. Perhaps there's a new job to create, which is the science policy interface people that read science, that know science, that were scientists at some point, but they spend their life doing something else, outreach,
yes.
Synthesis, digesting and talking to politicians, understanding the language of politicians, of people, and of science. So that, I think, is a job in itself. I think it's very difficult to ask for scientists to be creating new knowledge and at the same time do that proficiently. It's another job.
Yeah, Miguel, just let me do a small comment. It's so obvious that we have knowledge transfer when we think about, spin-offs and, in innovation. But we are never thinking, and in fact, I'm thinking just now that you don't think when we think about biodiversity to say knowledge transfer. How can we transfer this knowledge into the private companies, well, into some urban areas, and I think this was quite an interesting point that, for instance, I never thought about.
No, but I mean, for example, when biodiversity, plants and animals that live in the soil and everything. So this is a very quick comment. They affect, for example, the hydrological system, water, right? So when you're protecting a forest in a given mountain, for example, you are regulating the water flow that goes to the lowlands and that is available for agriculture. Stopping that water from flowing from the rivers to go then and be used for agriculture, what's the value of that? I mean, it's immense. And go on, and soil formation, carbon sequestration, all of these services, and that's the language that we've tried to adopt in the previous years, and we know very little about the services. I mean, Ruben and Elena, they talked about it, but end of the day, we don't really know. We know the general theory, but we don't know what's the role of every. So by not knowing, we can't really say, well, this is worth that. We can make general statements, and they're true, but we cannot go to the details. So that communication is not always easy. It needs to be improved.
Elena is dying to do a last comment.
No, because we cannot disconnect this from people. And we tend to, even when we bring up the issue of emotional in the communication, and which I agree, I mean, we should promote these emotional connections because we need them and we have them. But we tend to forget people. And never been so essential to bring people into even in our science, because I mean that's in the end when we want to preserve biodiversity, because we need people, the well-being in societies and communities to have access to all the essential needs to have a good life. And that's a target of all of us, and we tend to, and so maybe this is also a challenge for us, because I mean, as part of the communication, and this is also part of the emotional strategy that we need in the global narrative of promoting biodiversity, and we tend to forget it.
We need to end, and before I end, I really need, in the name of the organizers, once again, Vereador Sá Fernandes, it's here. I think this was a great opportunity. Lisboa, Capital Verde, although with this pandemic situation, but we were able to do this meeting, and I really thank to all of you, to the public also that participate, and thank you so much for this moment that I think it was really nice. Thank you very much.